at least get the introduction going, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Smith. This is Dr. Eric Smith. He has a very long and interesting bio, which you can check out on the St. Andrew website or the Iliff website. We took it from the Iliff website and put it on ours. So either place, you'll get the same information. He is currently the assistant professor of early Christianity and contemporary Christian practices. Dr. Smith has written several books, including the one he is currently working on, involving the reading of the book of Acts through post-colonial and decolonial perspectives on sovereignty. I can't wait to understand what that means. And Dr. Smith is an ordained minister, and he has ministered in the United Methodist Church as well as the United Church of Christ. He's currently employed by Plymouth Congregational. He's led travel seminars and is in demand as a presenter in educational settings around Denver churches. St. Andrew is very happy to welcome him again. I think you may even want us to ask him to come back, but we'll see. This is just the first night, right? So without taking any more of his time, let's welcome Dr. Eric Smith.
It's so good to see
everyone mute. Okay.
Yeah. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new faces, and I recognize some names of people. It's weird. It's a weird world that we live in these days with everything happening through a screen, but it's good to be able to be together in this way. I don't know about you. I've been able to attend some things, that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to attend. So maybe not everyone would want to be out on a dark, snowy night, but we can be together this way. So I'm really glad to be with you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I'm always really bad at this, so forgive me for the awkwardness. You would think that I would be better at it, but I'm not. So can someone confirm? Because now that I've shared it, I can't see. Now, is it the presentation version or is it just the version with the slides down the left? Jill, can you tell?
The slides are still on the left.
All right, so if I go like that, now are we?
Does
that work?
Now I
right.
see a main slide right in front of me.
You're in presentation mode now.
Yeah, but see, now I can't see my notes, which is the frustrating thing. I wish they would make it. See, this is what's frustrating.
There should be a presentation mode too.
We don't mind seeing the slides on the side. We can't read them. They're tiny.
Yeah, my problem is, there we go. We'll just do it this way. So you can still see my slides, right? We'll just do it this way. All right. Well, yeah, so thank you for the introduction. As Jill said, I'm working on a book on Acts right now. In fact, I'm just kind of finishing it at the moment, trying to do the last little bits of it. And all that stuff that Jill said about, sovereignty and post-colonialism and stuff like that. Basically what I'm interested in, there's this really great theory called necropolitics, which is, you might recognize the root necro in there, which means death. And it's sort of a way of thinking about sovereignty as the power over life and death. And so it comes out of cultures and places where colonial powers have come in and sort of dominated people and squeezed resources out and things like that. And so it's a way to talk about sovereignty having to do with control of bodies and whose body is at the disposal of whom. And so that's kind of the way I'm trying to read Acts right now. So you'll see as I go through the next 4 weeks, that's kind of the thing I'm most interested in when I read Acts right now, is this question of sort of how to how do people's bodies get controlled in the book of Acts? And I think actually Acts is the most charged of all the New Testament books this way. And I'll say more about what that means as we kind of get going. So I want to start, and again, I can't really totally see what you can see. I think you're on this big main slide, but I want to start with this question of what the genre of Acts is. And I've put some of the things up here that people often say, because I thought it would be too awkward for us to kind of raise our hands and offer suggestions. So Acts is the only book like it in the New Testament. It's the only book that does what Acts is trying to do. So we have 4 gospels, we have a bunch of letters, but we only have one book of Acts. Now there are other Acts that are not in the New Testament. There's a bunch of apocryphal Acts that sort of follow the adventures of different figures. My favorite of these is the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So if you're interested in an interesting read, on a snowy night after we're done, you can go and look up the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which follows the story of this woman named Thecla who was engaged to be married, and she heard Paul preaching from her window and was so enthralled by what she heard, she broke off the engagement, kind of alienated her whole family, not to mention her fiance, and kind of followed Paul along and became sort of a female Paul. There's just a fascinating story about what it means to be an apostle and gender, of course, and all that kind of stuff. So Acts is not alone in all of literature, but it is the only thing like this in the canon. And so one of the kind of boxes we try to put Acts in is the box of history. We kind of say, well, it's the only history in the New Testament. And I think that's true in a lot of ways, that Acts is, doing something like history, but we can't quite say it's just like the history that we think about today, because when we think about history in the year 2021, we often think about, attention to factuality is really important with historical work. We sort of have this notion that the truth in history corresponds to some sort of factual reality, and that's not exactly what ancient historians thought they were doing. So the best example of this is there was an ancient Greek historian, I think it was Herodotus, but it was one of those guys, who told the story of a ship, out on sea, and it's in the middle of a storm, and the storm's really bad, and the captain calls all the men together and gives them this big speech and says, look, this storm is really bad. We might not make it, but I want you all to stay at your post and do your duty. And so he kind of gives this rousing speech. And then the storm gets worse and the ship sinks and everyone on board dies. And so the question then becomes, well, how does the historian know what the captain said if everyone on board died in the storm? And the answer is that for ancient historians, that's not really the right question. The question of history in the ancient world is, what would someone with the character of a ship's captain have said in that crisis, that moment of crisis? And you sort of craft your history to tell the tale. It's almost a morality tale. And it's only, in the Enlightenment, much later, that we all decided that factuality is what history should depend on. Up until that point, people didn't really feel that way. So the author of Acts, often does seem to care about factuality, but that's not the only thing the author thinks about and cares about. So it doesn't quite fit into our conceptions of history. Lately, a lot of people think that the best category is epic. And so the best analogy to this in the ancient world is something like the Odyssey or the Iliad. These sort of grand epic stories that have elements of the supernatural and heroism and just adventurous kind of sea journeys. And you can see a lot of that in the book of Acts, where there are people just undertaking dramatic tasks. You can almost think about something like the stories of Hercules, right? There's all these jobs that need doing, and so the people in the story go and do them, and Acts kind of works that way. There are people who read this as an ancient novel or a novella. A romance actually is sort of the category it fits into, even though there's not much of what we would call romance in Acts. it's an apologetic. That is, it's in some ways an argument for Christianity. And so it's not a neutral account. It's not trying to be neutral. It's trying to convince you that the thing it thinks is true is true. And so in some ways it's functioning that way. It's sort of the first history of the church. So it's often thought of as like an institutional history. And you could think of it as propaganda. And there's probably other categories too that we could think about with the book of Acts. But so in terms of genre or category, it's hard to say for sure. There's not that, partly that's because we don't have any other things to compare it to. You could actually ask some of the same questions about the gospel, the genre of gospel, right? That gospels aren't quite a biography. They're not quite a story, like a short story. There's some sort of weird hybrid category, and Acts is the same kind of thing, that it doesn't quite fit our notions. So I'm going to go to the next slide now. And what follows quickly after that question of genre is, well, who wrote this thing? The first thing to say is that Acts is anonymous. And actually, most of the books in the New Testament are anonymous, which is maybe surprising to people. All the Gospels are anonymous. A lot of well, actually, just the Gospels and Acts are anonymous. But then other books are pseudonymous, which is they're written by someone else than who they claim to be by. And this is something that kind of weirds us out in the 21st century, but it was normal in those days. So Acts doesn't claim to be written by anyone in particular, but there's been this long tradition since like the 2nd or 3rd century that the person who wrote Acts was the same person who wrote Luke, which is of course also anonymous. We don't know who wrote Luke, but there's this old tradition that the person who wrote both Luke and Acts was this person named Luke. And so even though that's not what the text claims for itself, that's kind of what most scholars think. And if you go through and do, analysis of the grammar and the vocabulary, and if you look at some of the major themes, it does kind of hang together. If you think about Luke and Acts as a 2-volume set, it does make some sense. Often, so I'm just going to call this person Luke, and we'll all just agree that we don't really know who it was, but we're going to say Luke. So was Luke a Jew or a Gentile? And does it matter? So often, Luke is considered to be the only author in the New Testament who is a Gentile. I don't actually think that's true. I think Luke was a Jew, but a lot of scholars think, well, this is the one author of the New Testament who's a Gentile. And you can kind of see in different places, both in the Gospel and in Acts, that often there's some insider knowledge about how Judaism worked, and so maybe that's evidence that this person is Jewish, but there's also sometimes polemic. There's like arguments against Jews that would make you think, well, this person's not an insider. There's someone who's on the outside arguing that Jews do the wrong thing sometimes. And of course, there's always the possibility that insiders can think that too. I'm sitting at Iliff right now in my office in a United Methodist school, and I know that you're all associated with the United Methodist Church, so you know plenty well that insiders can have critiques of institutions, right? That it's not only outsiders who will say the church is doing something wrong. The United Methodist Church right now is sort of split over some issues. So that might be what's happening, is that Luke is a Jew who's critiquing Judaism in certain kinds of ways from the inside. I think that's probably what's happening. There's an interesting question about, does Luke have connections to Roman power? And the reason for this is that often, as we'll see as we go through, often anytime Luke has the chance, he will flatter Roman power. He'll sort of make it look like they're not as bad as they could have been, or he'll often be trying to describe Christianity in a way that makes it not feel threatening. And there's a even linguistic things, like when he introduces Roman officials, sometimes he'll use the language of most excellent. He'll call someone most excellent, and that's a way to address a Roman official. And actually, the books themselves are dedicated. Both Luke and Acts are dedicated to someone named Theophilus. And scholars debate whether Theophilus is the real person whose name was Theophilus, or a symbolic person, because Theophilus means lover of God. But he calls Theophilus in Luke, like Luke 1, 4, I think. He calls him most excellent Theophilus, which suggests that maybe Luke is writing this whole thing dedicated to a Roman official to try to explain Christianity. Like, here's what we're up to. No, nothing scary here. Please don't hurt us. And so that's one theory for who Luke was, and it might explain why there's so much flattery of Roman power. There's a lot of skill in Luke's writing and Luke's work, and so often the story on Luke is, well, Luke was a physician, a doctor, and that might be true, but it seems like the training here is that of a historian, that of someone who is used to kind of looking at sources and putting them together and to make a narrative. And there's a lot of skill, in the literary craft of Acts and of Luke. And then finally, this is one of my favorite little theories. People argue over where this person might have come from and written from. And my favorite argument, there's different things put forth. My favorite arguments come from, like, there's a section that we'll see in week 3 where there's a lot of attention really closely paid to the city Antioch. And so maybe there's a lot of attention paid to it because it's important to Luke, and Luke maybe comes from Antioch. Or better yet, Thessaloniki and Philippi are 2 cities in Macedonia, in sort of northern, what's now northern Greece. And so maybe that's, and actually there are places where Luke uses really specific local terms that people outside of there wouldn't have known. And so maybe that's evidence that he comes from those places, which is just interesting to me. Connected to this question of authorship is then this question of when was it written? And this is a really important question because it has to do with what we should think about the historical nature of what we're reading. So if it's written, in 75, for example, then it's probably being written a generation after the things it's describing, give or take. If it's being written in 120 or even later, then it's being written several generations after what it's describing. And that might or might not make a difference. If Luke is working with sources, it might not matter that much. But if it's based on some sort of eyewitness account, then it probably does matter. For a long time, everyone was pretty sure that it was written in that earlier time frame of 75 to 90. So right after the Gospels, or around the same time as the Gospels, which makes sense if you think, the same person wrote Luke and Acts. It makes sense that they would have been written pretty closely together. Lately, though, all the cool kids are saying, no, it's probably written in the 120s. And there's good reasons for that too. One of those is that Acts seems to use sources that didn't even exist until the very, very late 1st century. And so, like Josephus, for example. So if Luke is reading Josephus and using Josephus to write Acts, then he couldn't have written it before Josephus wrote his stuff. So, the earliest reference to Acts, by the way, comes from the late 2nd century from an author named Tertullian. So that's the earliest time we ever have anybody mentioning Acts, but of course it could have been written quite a bit earlier than that. The other reason this really, really matters is because some pretty important stuff happened in the late 1st century. So here, finally, there's some pictures to look at instead of just words on the screen. So between the years 66 and 70, there is this cataclysmic event that takes place in Judea. So just to kind of give you a timeline, Jesus is born around the year 0, somewhere in there, which is why we call it the year 0. He dies sometime around the year 30. Paul comes along and starts his mission probably sometime around the year 40. Paul dies sometime around the year 60, and all these dates are a little fuzzy. And then between 66 and 70, there's this huge war between Judea, which is a province of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire itself. There's a rebellion, there's a revolt, and it's called the Jewish War. It's actually called the First Jewish War. There were 3 of them right in a row, but the first one is the one that's really, really important. And it's important because if the Jewish War comes through and sort of flattens everything and destroys everything, including, by the way, the temple, including all of Jerusalem and a lot of the surrounding countryside, and if the Jewish War has caused, according to this historian Josephus, 1 million people to be killed and another several 100,000 to be taken into slavery, then that's going to be really important to the narrative of Acts. It's going to have influence on the way Acts is written, because it's just such an important event. So, for example, if you take my favorite analogy to this is, if you look at Acts, you see all these stories happening in the temple, which we'll get to in a minute. The temple is this really important setting, especially for the beginning part of Acts. And it's kind of like if you're reading a novel and it's set in the year 2000 in the World Trade Center. Now, you as the reader know that if something's set in the World Trade Center in the year 2000, that the World Trade Center itself is a character in that story. It's going to be an important thing that it's set in that time and place, because we all know what the people in the story don't know, which is that that setting is about to be destroyed. We know because we live on the other side of 9/11. And so the same is true for Acts. No matter what date, we give to Acts, whether it's that early date or later date, it's on the other side of that Jewish war. And the temple that they're all hanging out in, and the city of Jerusalem that they're all hanging out in, it's gone. It's been destroyed because the Jews lose the war, and the Romans win it. So what you're looking at here is a model of the temple up top there. You can go to Jerusalem today and see this model. I guess you could go to Jerusalem today if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic. You can see this model. This is the temple complex, and you get a sense of how it's laid out. You can see sort of on the left up there a colonnade, and it's possible to look down from that colonnade, and on I can't remember if it's this one on the left or those little towers on the right, but one of those is where some of the Roman forces were stationed, so they can actually look down into the temple and kind of keep tabs on what's going on inside the temple precincts, which gives you a sense of when Paul, for example, is being kind of chased by a mob in chapter 21 or 22 of Acts, and the soldiers come and rescue him. Well, that's why, because they can see what's happening. So it's important to be able to think about the space, even though we know as the readers that the space has been destroyed. And then below that is a picture from the Arch of Titus, which is found in the city of Rome. And this is a triumphal arch that Titus erected to commemorate the victory of the Roman Empire over the Judeans in the Jewish War. And you can see there, if you look really closely, the menorah being carried off as a treasure from the temple. So this is a really, really important question of how close to the Jewish war is this being written, because that might help explain some of the things that Acts is saying about the Roman Empire. It might help explain some of the things it's saying about Judaism, is if it's kind of being written in the rubble of that conflict, then it makes sense that Luke would be trying to say, look, there's nothing dangerous about us. We're not like them. Please don't persecute us. Or it might explain why, the temple authorities, the Jerusalem authorities are being depicted as sort of shady kind of characters, because the reader is going to know that those people ultimately lost. So that's part of what's at stake in that question. A couple more preliminary things. This one to me is just really interesting. We were talking, Jerry and I were kind of talking about text criticism before we started, and this the Acts is a really interesting case. So in every biblical text, there are differences between manuscripts. This manuscript has this and this one has that, because they're hand copied, and there's always going to be little mistakes and that kind of thing. Some of them aren't mistakes, some of them are intentional. And so this is true of every biblical text, and that's part of the work of biblical scholarship, is kind of sorting all that out. But Acts is really unique in that it existed in two major forms in the manuscript tradition, one of which is about 9% longer than the other. So it's kind of a paraphrase of the other one. And it's really unusual for things to exist in such different forms. So it's a little bit of a messy manuscript tradition, and people argue over why that might be the case. Maybe one's a rough draft and the other one's a fuller draft, and they both ended up kind of getting passed on. But it's hard to know for sure. There's some evidence for sources in Acts. So I said earlier, Luke is probably this really sophisticated historian who knows how to work with sources and knows what he's doing. And there's some evidence of this. So if you're reading through Acts, especially starting, I think, in about chapter 16, it'll switch from the third person to the first person, just without warning, without any transitions. It'll be saying they did this, they did that, they went here, they said that, and then we did this thing, and we went over here and we said this. And it does this, I think, in 4 or 5 different sections without warning, without any transition, and then it switches back to third person just as quickly. So that's a really strong clue that what we have there is some kind of source that's been dropped into the text, and it's just, you know, not been smoothed out by changing all the verbs and stuff. And week 3, we'll notice that there are some places where Acts seems to be telling the story from the perspective of one particular group of people. So especially when there's conflicts, as happens, you know, in the middle chapters of Acts between Paul and the church in Antioch and the church in Jerusalem, it seems to be following the story from one particular perspective rather than having like that 30,000 foot view. And that's probably because that's the source Luke had, and he was working with the sources he had. So, you know, that's just some sort of insider stuff about that. Some of the themes of Acts, you know, I said at the beginning, we often think about it as like a history, right? As a story of origins for Christianity. And I think that's true, but there's a lot more to it than that. So, you know, I said off the bat, I'm really interested in the themes of empire and power in Acts. And then this question of diaspora. Diaspora just means dispersion or the spreading out of people. And so, you know, already by the time Jesus was born and lived, there was a Jewish diaspora in the Mediterranean region that came from, you know, the Babylonians taking over Judah, and a lot of people were exiled at that point. So there's Jews living all over the Roman Empire. And then, of course, after that Jewish war we were just talking about, a lot more Jews left the Holy Land, left Israel, left Judah, and moved out all over the Roman Empire at that point. And so there's this strong diaspora of people spread everywhere. And that's sort of a theme of Acts that follows all the way through, as we'll see. And part of that question of diaspora is the question of belonging. You know, if you're a Jew, which I should stop and say, the word Jew is even not very stable. We think of when I say you know, Judaism or Jew or Jewish, we think of, oh, well, I know where the synagogue is, and I know someone who's Jewish, and I know what it means to be Jewish, and here's the practices. But the word in Greek is actually Judaios, and it doesn't mean Jew in the modern religious sense. It means a Judean. And there are some people, a lot of people, and I think I'm one of these, who think that you shouldn't translate it Jew at all because it's more confusing than it is helpful. You should translate it Judean because it's a geographical marker, not a religious one. And so if you're a Judean, if you're a Judaios who lives in Rome, are you Roman or are you Judean? And can you be both? And what does it mean to have that kind of belonging? Sort of the same question is, what does it mean to be Irish in American? Or what does it mean to be Nigerian and British? You know, these identity gets complicated that way. And we see this as a plot point a lot in Acts, where some of the major characters are sort of, they have hybrid identities. They have diaspora identities that are more complicated than they look on the surface. So, for example, there's this scene early on that we'll see where, you know, there's Jews from Asia, that is Judeans from Asia Minor, what's now Turkey, and they're arguing with Paul, who's a Judean from Tarsus. They're both diaspora Judeans. Neither of them was born in Judea, but they're arguing over the best way to be a Judean. And that's just a really complicated state of affairs, and Acts is often playing on that. All that's happening at the same time where Jerusalem and the temple are super important in the narrative. Like a lot of stuff happens in Jerusalem, a lot of stuff happens in the temple, which again is sort of this haunted landscape. There's this really strong focus on, you know, just how Jewish these people were. They were doing all the Jewish things. They were going to the temple for Jewish sacrifices. They were following Jewish law. And at the same time, they're following Jesus. And more Gentiles are coming into the Jesus movement. And what does that mean? It's a big kind of theme of Acts. There's a lot of violence in Acts. A lot of people who are chased by mobs, a lot of people who are stoned, a lot of people who are beaten. some people who were killed. So there's just a lot of violence under the surface, as you might expect in those kind of circumstances. And there's a lot of times when someone will stop and give a speech about what it means to be saved by God, salvation history. So, Stephen is a great example. Stephen is often known as the first martyr. We're going to see him in a few minutes. And the speech he gives, if you're about to be martyred, this mob has chased you down and cornered you, and they're like, all right, last words. And he gives this speech about Israel's history, which isn't maybe the best way to get yourself off the hook if you're about to get martyred, but it's the thing that seemed like the right thing for him to say in that moment. So there's, there are these frequent recitations of like, here's what God has done for us through history, which is kind of interesting. And then finally, there's this theme throughout Luke and Acts of the world turned upside down. And in fact, this is something that when the apostles when Paul and his companions get to, I think it's Thessaloniki, people there, the Jews in the synagogue there say, well, these are the people who've been turning the world upside down. So it's not a Hamilton quote, it's an Acts quote. And part of that is for Luke, that there's these inversions. The last are becoming first. The women are becoming powerful. The poor are becoming, the ones who inherit the earth. This is a theme all the way through Luke and Acts, and you can really see it strongly in Acts. And by the way, if you're interested in that, and if you want a really easy to read, interesting book on Acts, there's one by Justo Gonzalez, who's a United Methodist. It's called The Story Luke Tells. And it's, like $5 on a Kindle if you want to just grab it. And he makes a lot of this, what he calls this the great reversal, that, Acts and Luke are always interested in telling you how God is overturning all the expectations of the world, which is a pretty compelling story. All right. All that to get us to the starting point. So we'll get to the starting point of Acts here. And I think this is really an interesting place to start because, as I said, Acts is infused with all these questions of power and violence and government and politics. And so right here at the beginning in Acts 1:6, you probably can't read this because it's tiny, but I'll read it out loud. And it says in 1:6, so when they had come together, they asked him, that is Jesus, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? Which I think is a really natural question, right? These people had just seen Jesus crucified and they had just seen Jesus raised. And they thought he was the Messiah, which is this political term that means the person who's going to come and be in the lineage of David and restore the Israelite kingship. And so it's a natural question for them to ask, look, was this when it's going to happen? Is it happening now? Is that what's going on? Are you going to restore the kingdom? And Jesus essentially says, hold your horses. You're not going to be able to know when that happens. But you will receive power in 1:8 when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So right up front, Acts has this framing of like geopolitics, where the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, are thinking, okay, this is the moment we've all been waiting for, where the kingdom of Israel is going to be restored in all of its glory. God's going to put everything right again. It's all going to be fine. And it doesn't happen. There's this sort of defeated expectation, or this delayed expectation, where they thought the kingdom was coming. There's this great quote from this old Bible scholar, something Loisy is his name, where he says, they came asking for a kingdom and they ended up with the church. And so instead of the kingdom, what they get is the church. They get the Spirit. And Jesus says, no, the kingdom's not here yet, but the Spirit is going to be with you. But what's going to happen with the Spirit? Well, you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem. So a center in Jerusalem, but then in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And actually, that little programmatic verse in 1:8 is how the book of Acts proceeds. It starts in Jerusalem, and then it goes to Judea and Samaria in the middle, the early chapters like 7, 8, 9, and then to the ends of the earth. And for Acts, the ends of the earth are places like Ethiopia. We meet the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. Places like Rome, which is on the other side of the Mediterranean. And so this is the program of this book: is you're not going to get the kingdom of God yet, but you're going to be the ones who announce that it's coming, and you're going to do that here and a little further out, and a little further out, all the way to the ends of the earth, which is a pretty political agenda, I think. And you start to see this really come into play at the story of Pentecost. And you've probably heard this story a bunch of times, if you're the kind of people who go to church a lot, because once every year on the day of Pentecost, this story will be read out loud in church, and it's a big deal. There's a lot of days in Lent, there's a lot of days in ordinary time, but there's only one day of Pentecost. So churches tend to make a big deal about Pentecost. And we tend to think of it as sort of the birthday of the church, right? Like that's how my church talks about it, is, okay, this is the day that the Spirit came and the church got born. But it's really, if you look at it closely, it's a very political, geopolitical sort of thing, where they're all together in one place, and then there comes this rush of violent wind, a sound that's like a rush of violent wind, and divided tongues as a fire appeared among them. And they were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, in 2:5, there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And the apostles started speaking in all these languages, and everyone could understand their own languages. And they said, well, aren't these people Galileans? How are they able to do this? Like, aren't they all from Galilee? And there's this list that happens in 2:9: Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We all hear our own language. So here, when the Spirit comes, it's this sort of globalizing narrative where suddenly there's a vision of the whole world, what the book of Acts calls an oikomene, or ecumenical. That's where we get our word ecumenical, where the whole world is suddenly in view. And we can imagine suddenly that this thing will spread to the ends of the earth, as it said it would in chapter 1. And I think we have to appreciate that when Acts makes this claim, when it says, lists off all these places, these are not neutral places. These are places that belong to the Roman Empire. So there's already kind of this implicit challenge to the Roman Empire that that Acts is telling a story that's going to somehow put a dent in that empire. And that if the kingdom of God really is coming, that's going to be a problem for the kingdom of Rome. And those two things are in some ways sort of on a collision course from the beginning. So, that's sort of the way the whole thing starts, is by casting a vision that's pretty broad in certain kinds of ways. In response to this, Peter gives a speech, the first big speech of Acts. And Acts loves speeches, by the way. So if you're reading through Acts, if you're really inspired at the end of tonight, you just want to read through Acts, you're going to notice that about every couple chapters, someone will get up and give a really, really long speech. And these are, tedious sometimes, if I'm being honest. They can be kind of long-winded. And they are kind of like that speech that ship's captain gave when the ship was going down. They're probably not eyewitness accounts of what happened in that moment, but rather they're Luke's kind of account of what should have happened in a moment like that. And so I think you see that here. So Peter stands up and he says, look, we're not drunk. It's because everyone thought they were drunk because they were babbling about, in foreign languages. He says, we're not drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. But then he quotes Joel, the prophet Joel. And he quotes this thing about how it's going to happen that, that people will do the things that these people are witnessing. Interestingly, Luke changes the Joel citation. In Joel, it says after these things, and in Acts, it says in the last days. So, Acts is sort of explicitly saying these are the last days and these things are happening in the last days. And likewise, there's another change in there that, let's see, in 2:18, where it says, even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days, I will pour out my Spirit. And Luke adds, and they shall prophesy. So that's kind of pointing to the Spirit. So it's a kind of creative citation of Joel that's going on here. But so Peter's speech right off the bat kind of says, yes, what you're seeing is miraculous. And what it means is that these are the last days, that we're living in sort of this moment of intense change in the world where God is intervening in history to do something new. And therefore, watch out, because things are going to start happening. Something interesting does happen starting in that section of Acts then, which is especially like the first 5 or 6 chapters of Acts. It's got this great expectation that the world is about to change. God's intervening. It's got this vision that's sort of global, as far as they knew the global scale, that was this whole world vision of how far this thing's going to go. And then it zeroes in on Jerusalem in these really fascinating ways. Even though the vision is like, to the ends of the earth, it's zeroing in on Jerusalem. And it's zeroing in on this community of people who are left in Jerusalem after Jesus's death. And it's describing the life of those people in very kind of utopian ways. I don't know if you've ever noticed this about Acts, but it kind of talks about that community in ways that are pretty remarkable. So it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. So it sounds really great. It sounds like the kind of community I would love to belong to. It sounds very pure. It sounds very idealistic. And I think importantly, it sounds both very Jewish. They're in the temple, they're praying, they're doing all the normal Jewish piety stuff. And it sounds very contrary to the values of the Roman Empire. So they're living this sort of withdrawal from capitalism. They're withdrawing from the systems of domination that an empire brings. And they're saying, we're not going to compete with each other. We're going to share what we have. And we're going to pray together, and we're going to eat together, and it's going to be great. This is not the only passage that says that. There's a lot of passages that that kind of speak to this, and that the key word in a lot of them is like together. They were together, and there's a real focus on the unity of this early movement. And so a good example of this is this passage, which is too long probably for you to read and too long for me to read out loud. But this is a passage from Acts 3, if you want to go find it in the Bible that you brought, if you brought one. And it's a pretty typical story from this beginning part of Acts, where people they go to the temple and they're in prayer together in the temple, and they're carrying out work that looks a lot like the work that Jesus did, but they're doing it not in Nazareth or not in Galilee, but they're doing it in the temple itself. And then they get into this discussion of salvation history. Remember, I said this is one of the themes of Acts, that they discuss all the time, sort of what it means that God has been saving us all along. And there's this claim that, oh yeah, the same God who saved us in Israel's history is the God who is doing all these things now that you're seeing. So there's continuity, with the tradition that they're pointing to, and there's continuity with the tradition, but also discontinuity, in that they're sort of implicitly rejecting the people who rejected Jesus, which is, I think, is an interesting move. So they're kind of claiming the history of Israel, but not quite claiming Israel as it exists in that moment. Interestingly, to kind of take a step back for a moment, this is the kind of thing that gets metabolized in the history of Christianity as an anti-Judaism. So it's really important as we read Acts, there's all these critiques of Israel, critiques of Judea, and Christians often, take that as a license to say, yeah, Jews are terrible. That's not at all, I think, what the text of Acts is saying. And I think that's exactly the wrong move for Christians to make. And that's not what Acts is intending, but rather it's intending to kind of make a judgment from an insider point of view, in the same way, that you might critique your bishop, or we might critique our governor as Coloradans. They will make criticisms of their leaders, but that doesn't mean that they're saying all Jews are bad, because they are themselves Jews. Another kind of way of articulating group cohesion, I'm trying to kind of hustle because I want us to have time to talk a little bit at the end. this is a really fascinating example. It's a great stewardship sermon. The story of Ananias and Sapphira, if you've ever heard this one. So, there's this really beautiful vision where, we're living together, we're praying together, we all share everything, we eat food together. And there's this sense that it's utopia. And here comes Ananias and Sapphira, and they have property that they sell, and they give some of the proceeds of it to the community, and they give other proceeds of it to themselves. And so it's an interesting question why they do that. And maybe they're just not, maybe they're hedging their bets, maybe maybe they just didn't realize what they'd signed up for. But as soon as it's kind of found out that they have done this, they confront Ananias, and he just falls down and dies. And then Sapphira walks in later, and the same thing happens to her. She falls down and dies. And so scholars actually argue about this. I was just working on this passage the other day. Does God kill them? Is that what's happening here? Or do they die, because they have just violated the sense of community, that they just can't live anymore? Like, what is it exactly that kills them? And the text is really unclear about it. It just says that they fall down and die. And so some people say, well, it's modeled on this notion of the temple sacrifice. And if you make an improper sacrifice in the temple, then God, according to the Hebrew Bible, will strike you dead. And so it's saying, this is a signal that the temple has been spread, and that now they're kind of living in the temple symbolically. And then if they don't make the right kind of sacrifice, then they will die. But it's, it's fascinating. And it's this kind of signal that, yeah, it's a utopian community, but they're also playing with fire in certain kind of ways, that if you're not all in, then you're out. And it's sort of that, I don't know, darker side of utopia there. So, it suggests that the unity that Acts is always describing might not have been complete unity, that there are people who are on the outside of that unity. The other thing that happens, you start to see early on in Acts, and we see it a lot in Acts later on, is this conflict with authorities. And so here we have a case in this passage, which is also too small for you to really read, where the Sadducees, which are sort of the temple old guard party, they arrested some of the apostles. They apparently didn't like what they were doing in the temple, so they had them arrested. But the Lord rescues them, kind of breaks them out of jail. And that's really interesting. There's this sort of battle between civil authorities who are trying to enforce their sense of right and wrong, and then God, the Lord Jesus breaks them out of prison. That's a pretty it's kind of a clash of wills going on there. And then the third party, a Pharisee, who's like, the Pharisees were, the more strict interpreters of the law. A Pharisee is the one who kind of points out, well, wait a minute, we don't want to get on the wrong side of history here, so let's make sure we're doing the right thing. And so in the end, in the next slide, they're let go, but they're kind of warned, well, don't do it again. But we can't really do anything too bad to them, because we don't want to be on the wrong side of God. And so again, as I said earlier, you have a bunch of Judeans, some of which are native to Judea and others of which are Judeans from somewhere else, arguing over how to be Judeans the best way. What's the best way to be Jewish? And that's in some ways what happens all the way through the book, is this kind of question about how do we be who we are the best we can. And for some people in the book, that's by following Jesus. For other people, it's by not following Jesus, but being sort of a traditional Jew. And all the way through, they're arguing about it, which I think is really interesting, because I've already alluded a couple times, as United Methodist, you sort of know what it is to have an argument about what it means to be who you are. And that's true of all religious traditions. My own religious tradition, has this argument all the time about what does it mean to be who we are? What does it mean? What's our story? And who's on the inside of that story, and who's on the outside of that story, and how big is the story? Can it hold all of us? And I think that's what Acts is really up to a lot of the time. And so the big expression of this is kind of setting us up for next week, is this question of some of the major factions. So if there are people arguing over how to be Judeans, then the big factions early on in Acts, and then the ones that persist through the whole book really are the Hellenists and the Hebrews. And these seem to be two parties in the city of Jerusalem itself that probably it's a linguistic difference. Probably the Hellenists speak Greek and the Hebrews speak Aramaic, but it also might map onto other kinds of questions about how important Jerusalem is, how important the temple is. And as you can see here in Acts 6, there's some grumbling on the part of the Hellenists that their poor and their widows are not being taken care of by the community as much as the other people are. And so already there's this kind of sense of, that unity we've been talking about the whole time maybe isn't as unified. And this blossoms, as we'll see over the next couple of weeks, into this huge conflict that Paul gets embroiled in, that turns into this big question about, can Gentiles be Christians without first becoming Jews, which is a big question in the early movement. The question of, if you become a Jew, you have to follow the law, you have to get circumcised, which is no small thing in a time before anesthesia and antiseptics, to undergo a surgery. So it was a real barrier to conversion for Gentiles, and there was this big argument: do they have to do it or not? And it all kind of starts here with these two factions, and that's a story that'll play out over the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other's beautiful faces again, and have a little bit of time for discussion. Jill, we talked about how long this is going to go, and I think we said it could go till 8:30, but doesn't have to. So I'll leave it up to you to kind of guide us for our time. So just, given some of the themes we've talked about, what do you want to talk about? Do you want to look at certain passages in the book of Acts and work through them together? How do you want to proceed? Anybody have questions, comments? I'm going to take this opportunity to stop talking for a second. Harvey, I see your hand up.
Eric, thank you so much for the thorough overview at the beginning, and I just love the importance of this book. I think there are a couple of other themes that are meaningful to me, particularly in chapters 1 through 10. The mention several times, almost in every chapter, of the growth in numbers that is happening in the Christian community. Every day the Lord added to their number those who are being saved. I think that's how chapter 2 ends. And there are a couple of things important. The norm that's lifted up, I think, for today's church is we are embracing new people. And it's not just numerical growth, but it's also, the person who preaches the first Christian sermon in Acts 2 is one of the most despised of the disciples, who denies any connection to Jesus at the end of the Gospels. So it's personal growth and numerical growth, missional growth. In my mind, that's a theme. A second theme is, in Peter's sermon, God is the actor and Jesus is subordinate. One of the times we were in Jerusalem, one of the lectures we heard that evening was about Jesus raising himself from death. Well, that's not what the text says. The text says two important theological things. Jesus was a man, which deals with the controversy about Jesus' humanity and divinity. Jesus is a man whose credentials God proved to you. You killed him and God raised him from death. So there's a pretty profound, again, in my mind, picture that it's God who is at work through Jesus. In that ending of Acts 2, one of the popular translators of Scripture in the Message ignores the Greek text. He says, God added to their number those who were saved. Well, that's not what the Greek word says. It says being saved, which confirms Wesley's notion of sanctification. Salvation's a journey and we're in process. And that's true of the people in the book of Acts, and that's true of the people who were first baptized. The way I read Ananias and Sapphira, it's not just that they held back some proceeds when everybody else was more generous, it's that they lied about it. The end.
Yeah, I think those are all exactly right. And I especially love the point you made about who the actor is, because both Acts and, for that matter, the letters of Paul come before Christianity had worked out any doctrine of the Trinity, and they don't feel as beholden as we sometimes do to claim the full divinity or the full equality in divinity of Jesus. And so Paul almost never uses Christocentric language in talking about Jesus. He uses theocentric language, and it's not Jesus rising, it's God raising Jesus, which, as you're saying, has like pretty profound theological implications. And we've theologized all this stuff to the point where we can't usually see it. And we read it and we say, ah, yes, Jesus rose from the dead. Not really. Not quite. So, or at least it's complicated. Yeah. Yeah, and the growth thing too is interesting. There's a book by gosh, what's his name? I would have been able to say it 10 seconds ago, but there's a book that kind of goes through just running the numbers on how does Christianity go from this group of like maybe 50 people to the religion of the Roman Empire in 3 centuries. And it's not easy to get there. Like, you have to really grow exponentially at certain points. And I think you see the author of Acts trying to account for that sometimes. Like, how is it that we got from here to there? You see Eusebius accounting for it too, in the ecclesiastical history. Like, what's so compelling about this thing? And I think that's where the modern churches have some things to learn from Acts, and especially from these early chapters where they're just taking care of each other. And sometimes that's what's important about being church. I see there's 38 of us here at least, so I'm sure you all have things to say.
Well, I would just say the example of death of the two who lied, according to the story, that's reinforcing the in group. How do you keep it pure? How do you keep that standard? However they were defining it, and it was a new group, new definitions. So you kill off a couple people who violated. Now, whether that actually happened or is apocryphal, it still maintains this is deadly serious stuff we're dealing with as a community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people, go ahead. Sorry, Christy.
Oh, I was going to say, though, the idea of looking at it as written almost as historical fiction, or maybe as an epic tale, helps explain that they probably didn't really die. It was part of the story the author was telling to make a moral point. But I don't know. I think we have a problem in Christianity with trying to take things literally.
Yeah. Well, and there are other places. Agrippa, for example, dies in this very dramatic fashion. And actually, I'm preaching on May 16th, and the lectionary that day is not great, but the Acts text has the story of Judas, and they skip the part where Judas falls down and explodes. Like, you don't read that part out loud in church. You read the part before that and the part after that. But the author of Acts really loves making people die in like really comeuppance kind of fashion, where they get what's coming to them. And so I think I think there's room for us all to be right here that, yeah, their death is symbolic. Even if they did die, it's sort of theologized, right? It's made into an object lesson in hindsight, in the same way that you know, we might read someone's death today, if we're not feeling very generous that day, as an expression of what they had coming to them or something like that. And you know, I do think it's that in-group out-group dynamic that you were just talking about, that there is this really strong sense of cohesion, and if you violate that cohesion, then that's really dangerous. You should watch out. Yeah, and it makes sense that they would have felt that way, right? Because they're this beleaguered little small group in the middle of a big empire, and they would have felt like, you know, guarding the borders of their group was really important.
I have a question. This is Bob Alexander. I've read some things. Do you feel that Acts comes to an abrupt end, or not come to an abrupt end? And then why or why not?
I don't think there's any doubt that it comes to an abrupt end. The question is why.
Yeah, exactly.
So this will be week 4. But yeah, in case you haven't read this far in Acts yet, you know, it spends basically the second half of the book following this guy Paul around, and Paul is the hero of the whole thing. And every little thing, you know, what Paul eats for breakfast, you know, is a plot point. And then you get to Rome, and he's got an audience with the emperor, and the end. You know, there like what next? We don't know. And so, assuming that those things happened in the 60s, and assuming that this is written at the earliest in around the year 75, the author must have known what happened to Paul and just didn't narrate it. It's hard to imagine that he didn't know. And so the reasons to not narrate it might be that he knew that Paul had died in some inglorious way. The story goes that he was caught up in the persecutions of Nero. And so it just didn't fit the story he was trying to tell. And so he left it out. And Paul is sort of perpetually glorified in the text in a way that he's not in life. But there's also this other tradition. You can see this in Romans 15, where Paul says, look, I really want to go to Spain. And so it's possible that Paul got his wish, and that he got out of house arrest in Rome and went off to Spain, and that Luke just didn't know what happened to him and just left it open-ended, because he ended up in Spain, which is sort of the end of the world. But yeah, it's a real mystery, and people argue over that, like, because it's just it's hard to imagine, you know, that you would end the book that way after spending so much time with this person.
Yes, because there seems to be a controversy around that, and that you read different interpretations, and one interpretation says, you know, no, it didn't abruptly end, but yeah.
I don't know how you come. I mean, I think it abruptly ends. At least it ends short of the narrative arc that you would expect, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Acts is not otherwise sort of. It's not shy about, like, you know, showing the end of stories. It concludes its stories pretty faithfully. You know, Stephen. It would have been easy to end Stephen's story short of a martyrdom, but it didn't end short of a martyrdom. So. And you know, martyrdom's not a shame either. That's the other confusing thing. It's Jesus is a martyr, and his death gets narrated. Stephen is a martyr, his death gets narrated. James's death is a little bit. It gets like one verse, and that's a little bit of a weird case. But if Paul really did die in Rome, then why not tell the story? It's a really unsatisfying resolution to it that people argue over, and probably always will, frankly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a great question. Yes.
Question.
I assume that you're not actually St. Andrew.
No, my account when I set it up, leading some classes, has always had that moniker. I thought I changed the setting, but it's still reading that way. So I get to pretend. But it's kind of along the same veins that the last question was. A couple of us that are here tonight had taken the Journey Through the Bible class on the book of Acts, and that author of the study guide there kind of referred to the book of Acts as more of a story of the Holy Spirit and the acts of the Spirit. and described sort of some of the abrupt treatment of the characters, even Paul, because they were the second fiddle to the Spirit. I wondered if you would comment on that, or if that makes sense to you at all, that the Spirit is really the more important character, and Paul and Peter and everybody else are just players to that bigger story.
Eric, you're muted.
Yeah, no, sorry. So I was looking because I just happened to be working on a chapter where I talk about this. I have a list of all the things that the Spirit does in Acts. And but it's things like it forbids and it snatches. That's one thing the Spirit does, and it commands, and it really jerks people around in some pretty powerful ways in Acts, especially in sort of the middle of the book, I think. So yeah, I think it's been recognized for a long time that it's sort of the gospel of the Spirit in certain kinds of ways, and that the Spirit takes over as the main actor. Sort of in the same way we were saying a moment ago about God as the actor. I think that's true, but in Acts, the Spirit often gets the role of doing the things that a king or an emperor would ordinarily do. The Spirit is the one that gets to control your body and tell you where you're going to go. And the story that we'll see next week of of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch is I think really instructive, where at the end of that story, it's in chapter 8, Philip, once his job is done, he just kind of gets like evaporated. Like it's like Star Trek. He just gets beamed up and he finds himself somewhere else. And the Spirit has like this really profound control over people's bodies. Again, in a time before we'd really worked out a Trinity. And so no one really had a working definition, as far as I know, of like how this all fit together. But here the Spirit is kind of running the show. So yes. Who wrote that study guide? Do you remember?
I would have to look it up. If you want me to get the name, I can go grab it off my bookshelf. This big bookshelf.
I would be curious. Yeah, that'd be interesting to know. But partly because, I don't know what the study that you did was, but there's this interesting dichotomy between different interpretations of Acts, right? So, okay, you got it.
Dr. Justo Gonzalez.
Oh yeah, Justo Gonzalez.
He's was born in Havana, Cuba, and a United Methodist minister there.
Yeah, he's written about 1,000 books. I've got these 3 are required for my history class I'm teaching right now.
Okay, well, mine's a lot thinner.
Yeah. So
he was
yes,
at the
he's
Union
marvelous.
Theology Seminary in Cuba.
Yeah, actually, his cousin was in the Methodist church I served in North Carolina, another Cuban. But yeah, there's these sort of divergent interpretations of Acts that I think we should think about. One is it gets read often as a triumphant story of the rise of Christianity, that it's the story about how these people against all odds kind of beat the Roman Empire and made it to the center of power and took over everything. And it's told that way as sort of a missionary story where, when Paul goes to Athens, he shows those philosophers what's up in his speech. And there's this, when I've been on tours to like Philippi in modern day Greece, they make a big deal about, well, this is where the gospel first made it to Europe, as if they knew about continents in the year 50. So that's one way to kind of tell the story, is this triumph. It's almost like this European colonial view of how Christianity got started. And then the other, I think, is a lot more conflicted. And that's the view I kind of try to take on it, which is, yeah, it's a story of expansion and growth, and it's a story of success in a lot of ways, but it's also a story of how you have to always negotiate your place, and you have to figure out where you belong, and the belonging that you find is often full of conflict and complicated. And I think, that book I mentioned earlier about Justo Gonzalez, a different book called The Story Luke Tells, I think is, it's a little bit of a rosy picture, but I like his perspective overall. Part of my interest in this, by the way, comes from my own denomination, which is the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I think you've got an associate minister now who's Christian Church Disciples of Christ at St. Andrew. We know each other a little bit through some regional stuff. And part of our origin story is we come from the American frontier in the 19th century, which the frontier at that time was like Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. And there, there's this narrative of westward expansion and this narrative of Christian unity that kind of come together in ways that now we can recognize as like a little problematic. That westward expansion was into native territory, native lands, and it came at the expense, that unity came at the expense of other people's sovereignty. And so I think reading Acts that way is a little bit dangerous. And we have to be, thoughtful about how we read it as a triumph, because it's not always, the triumph doesn't always look the same to everybody, I guess. That's a long-winded way to say, yeah, that sounds great to me. And anything you can read by Justo Gonzalez, I recommend. He's pretty great. He has written 1,000 books, though. What other thoughts and observations are there? Other people from that Acts study, or people who just heard something that sparked their interest? And I'll let Jill be the arbiter of when we reach our stopping point.
Okay.
Has a question.
Eric, I've got a question. This is Steve. That's all right. Acts sure sounds like, the writing sure sounds like it was written by somebody who was with Paul on his journeys and actually taking notes like a reporter would, with exact quotes of what Paul said to people here and there. Would that have been the case, or would this have been a case of Paul telling somebody later on where he went and the kind of things he said?
That's a great unanswerable question, but it's a really good one, right? Of how does Luke know what he knows, and what are his sources? And so, I mentioned earlier those we sections, the places where it just switches into we. And so one of the things people think there is, okay, this is someone's travel diary, that they're kind of keeping track of what's going on and when, and that Luke somehow has gotten his hands on it. Maybe it's Luke's travel diary, or maybe he's gotten it from someone else. Maybe those we sections are Luke's own memories, his own experiences, and he just kind of drops them in without changing the verb tenses. So that's all possible. And he's clear, by the way, in the Gospel of Luke. He starts the Gospel of Luke assuming the same person wrote both, by saying, look, a lot of people have written accounts, and I've written my own orderly account, which is kind of a sneaky way to say those other ones aren't so orderly. And I've written my own orderly account to explain what's happened. So I think it's entirely possible that he had sources. It's probable, it's almost certain that he had sources. The question is, how far back they go, what was the nature of these sources? And I think it's unlikely that people were taking notes, along the way. The same way, it's unlikely that people were doing that when Jesus was teaching. It's just not what people were thinking in that moment. But rather, it's a process of memory that comes back, and people can remember what was said, and you capture the gist of what was said. There's a case we're going to look at, especially in week 3, of where we actually have what Acts is saying about a conflict, and then what Paul himself says about that conflict. So if you compare Acts 15 to Galatians 1 and 2, you've got 2 different sides of the same debate. And in that case, what Acts has Paul saying and doing is really at odds with what Paul says Paul was saying and doing. And so you have to kind of balance, well, who's got the truth? And I actually trust Paul more there, because Paul's writing his letter, a letter is different than a whatever Acts is written 50 years later or something like that. So, but it's an interesting question, like what are his sources, and what are the how trustworthy are they in that modern Enlightenment sense, I think is a really good question, but probably one that we'll never quite get all the answers to.
And to come off that question is, Bob, how do you see, to kind of tie off that a little bit maybe, there's what seems like hundreds of reference to people, places, events, all that in there in Acts. How does that, as you're writing a book on Acts, how does that tie together with true history during that time period? Does it?
Well, actually, a lot of people, it does, and a lot of people think, you know, that Acts is reading actually historians like Josephus, who's sort of the big historian of the time. So there's people who argue, well, he's just going through and reading Paul's letters and reading Josephus and kind of putting the narrative together that way. There are places though where Luke gets things wrong historically, which actually I think is a sign not of a weakness, but it's a sign that Luke is doing historical kind of work. So the best example is in the beginning of Luke, I always think of Charlie Brown Christmas. It's because it's the thing that Charlie Brown recites in the Christmas special. But in the reign of Caesar Augustus, when Quirinius was governor of Syria, there was never a time when Quirinius was governor of Syria and Augustus was Caesar. Those never overlapped with each other. But that's the way, Luke was trying to kind of put a pin in the timeline and say this happened at this point. He got it wrong, but the fact that he's trying to do it, I think is powerful. So I think Luke thinks about people and places as pins in the narrative to kind of give it veracity and give it a sense of reality. And that I think, points to what he thinks he's up to. He thinks he's doing something reliable. Whether it meets our 21st standards of reliability is almost irrelevant, but that's what he thinks he's up to. He's trying to tell a story the best way he knows how.
Thank you.
Hey, in that regard, I had another question too, if you don't mind chiming in there to follow up on that last one. We'll just keep ping-ponging. Do you think that some of the towns that he had, I mean, we know that Paul wrote about the towns that he went to and wrote letters to them, but it seems like all those towns had a lot of symbolic meaning in the story as well, in terms of them being very Roman towns, towns that were veteran colonies and important Roman emperor, cult of the emperor type locations. Do you think Luke was intentionally trying to show that story too, as far as, the choice of God to pick Jesus and resurrect him, juxtaposition to the emperor cults and what those people in those towns would have been experiencing in their day-to-day life before all this happened?
Yes, I think that's absolutely happening. And I think sometimes Luke uses things symbolically to make a point. So yes, I think actually Paul's ministry unfolds that way. I think Paul goes to those places because of those things. It's interesting to kind of notice that Paul is a very urban figure. He doesn't go to the countryside. He doesn't care at all about, the rural areas. He goes to cities, and only the really, really big cities are the ones he goes to. And with the possible exception of Galatia, which is a whole other debate. But it's also true that Luke uses symbolism. And so when you meet the Ethiopian eunuch, maybe there was actually an Ethiopian eunuch, but maybe you need to hear about an Ethiopian because you want to point towards the ends of the earth. When you meet Lydia there's these paired stories actually in Acts 16 of Lydia and the girl with the enslaved girl with the Pythian spirit or the Pythonic spirit. And in both cases, the spirit is identified with Delphi, which is a really important cultic center, the really important cultic center. And then Lydia, her name is Lydia, which is the name of a province where they make purple cloth. And who is she? She's a purple cloth maker. So it's in Eutychus in chapter 20, Eutychus is the guy who falls out of the window and seems like he might be dead. And Paul, it's not clear whether he resurrects him or just notices he's not dead. But in either case, Eutychus's name means lucky. right? So he's really interested in naming people symbolically, and naming places symbolically, or using places symbolically. So I think both are true, where, you know, the fact that they go to Philippi, which is a Roman colony, and point out that it's a colony is definitely a shot across the bow, you know, at the Roman Empire. But it's also true that Luke is a good storyteller at the same time, and uses things symbolically to kind of make points.
He's also making points with the Romans because the Jews always reject the message, and then Paul goes and shares it with the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. Which is not what Paul says he's doing in his own letters. So there's a real difference there. Paul thinks he's the apostle to the Gentiles, and that's who he's come to talk to. And in Acts, they always have him go to the synagogue, get rejected, and then go on to the Gentiles. So that's a real point of disagreement, partly because Luke, I think, really wants to show just how Jewish Paul is. And Luke is always kind of trying to play that up. And so he has him go to the synagogue until he's kicked out. Yeah, it's a good point. It's full, this is what I mean. It's like 28 chapters of just swirling allegiances. The whole thing is full of people, you know, who are allies until they're enemies, and enemies till they're allies. And you know, in some of these courtroom scenes, which we'll get to in the next couple of weeks, it's hard to tell, you know, who's on whose side. And the people who are who seem to be your friends are not your friends. And it's really fascinating as a view into life under empire, and sort of the pressure cooker that can put you in sometimes. We haven't even talked about the question of whether Paul was a Roman citizen, which Acts claims he was twice, but historians think he really wasn't. And so that's, you know, is that a storytelling device, or is that a historical thing, you know? And if he is a Roman citizen, why wait till after you've been beaten to bring it up? Maybe not the best time to deploy that. We've lost a few people, but they've still got some faithful Bible interested folks. Other questions or thoughts or things you want to bring up?
I have a lot of questions, but I assume some of them will be better at different lessons when you're talking about that material. But I think someone asked again about timing, and I was really, especially timing in Paul's career, like you had mentioned that there's all these extra stories about him possibly going on to Spain, or maybe that he spent time with the Roman church there. But right after his conversion, there's references to him going to Arabia, and long period of time that he may have been back in Antioch. Will you be addressing that later, or is this a good enough time to ask you about that a little bit, about the, you know, like the decade, I guess, after his conversion, but before he and Barnabas struck off on that first journey?
Yeah, both, I think. We'll definitely get to it, but it's complicated, and people argue like thousands of pages of ink spilled over this question of what Paul did and when, and how you pin down his biography, because the narrative that Acts tells is a little bit, not always, but a little bit in conflict, and a little bit just too fuzzy with what Paul says in his letters to really reconcile them. So I think this is actually part of what, if you looked at like Galatians 1 and 2, this is part of what Paul's so angry about in Galatians, is he's apparently heard that someone said after his experience on the road to Damascus, he went to Jerusalem and got his marching orders. And that, you know, the implication is, well, he's just a franchisee of the Jerusalem church. He's just doing what they tell him. He's really angry at that implication. He thinks, no, I was sent by God. I was not sent by any human being. And by the way, I didn't go to Jerusalem right away. I went off and I was taught by the Spirit. You know, that's where I learned this stuff. So that chronology gets really mixed up. And I'm reading this book right now. by James Dunn, beginning from Jerusalem. This is a 1,300 page book that is volume 2 out of 3. That gives you a sense of how thorough he is. And he just sort of says, we don't really know what Paul did and when. Within about 10 years, it's hard to know. So I tend in these things to trust Paul more than Acts, because I think Acts is writing with a kind of agenda that Paul isn't writing with in that moment. But it's the question of sifting through differing accounts and trying to sort it out. So yes, and the question of how often they go back to Antioch and there are very few kind of historical markers to pin things to. The proconsulship of Gallio is in Corinth is like the one. I think that we can say that happened like in 50 or 51 or 52. And other than that, there's not a lot of like firm things to pin the timeline to. So it's contested, which is what makes biblical studies fun. You get to argue about these things.
And when you start talking timelines, what are your thoughts on the actual timing of Acts? Since, there's no mention of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That could it have been written before? Because there's no mention of it. Could it have been written early?
I don't think so, but there are some people who think so. That to have Acts written earlier than 70 would mean that at least the Gospel of Luke, and Luke depends on Mark, so Luke and also the Gospel of Mark have to be written before 70. And so, you have to allow a year or two for Mark to be written and circulated enough that Luke gets his hands on it, and then a year or two for the Gospel of Luke to be written, then a year or two for Acts. And you start to really run into, historical problems of there's just not enough time back there. But people think so. I mean, some people think so. And so, if you look at Mark chapter 13, for example, it's called Mark's little apocalypse, because Jesus is with his disciples and they're looking at the temple and they're saying, oh, look how beautiful. And Jesus is like, well, if you think that's beautiful, it's going to get destroyed. Just you wait. And he sort of lays out basically the story of the Jewish war in Mark 13. And so that, to a lot of scholars, is evidence that Mark is written after the Jewish war, and he's having Jesus predict things that he knows is going to happen. Now, other scholars think, no, Jesus could just predict the future. And so depending on your theological perspective, you might have a different take on that. But for my money, I think it makes a lot more sense for Acts to be written late 1st century or even early 2nd century than it does for it to be written even close to 70. Just because you run into too many problems of anachronisms and there's also the problem, that the text of Acts we have isn't the one that was written whenever it was written. It's the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy of that, so there might have been things introduced to the text over time that, changed details or added details, and it's hard to really get back to an original text. So all that's to say, I don't know. It's hard to know.
You make some good points.
Which again is what's fun about it.
Yeah.
It's what's fun about it. Yeah. And I think, by the way, these are questions that we ask that wouldn't have been important to the people who wrote the New Testament. I think they're important questions to us, and I really like talking about them, but I'm not sure it would have mattered that much to Paul or to Luke. This question of when it was written.
Well, I came here to have fun, and by gum, this has been a rollicking good time. And I have learned so much and am ready to really dig into more. Thank you, Eric. This was terrific. But in fact, our time is up. So it is
I'm going to
time.
put that on my CV. Rollicking good time.
So we'll look forward to seeing everyone again next week.
It's been really fun to be with you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.